Soldier-0 Anby is the second attack agent to be announced in a row, what was otherwise a long period of anomaly characters being dominant. Once again, I tested every single team composition that could possibly include Anby. With this, today I'll be showing you how to play her, what her pros and cons are, and the surprising results I had after testing her across many different teams. As always, the goal with today's video is to give you guys a better idea of whether Soldier-0 Anby is worth pulling for on your account, but I'd like to remind you all that the footage from this video will be from the creator beta server, so things are subject to change. But with this out of the way, let's now break down every single Anby team in ZenlessZoneZero. Soldier-0 Anby focuses primarily on her mark system, which enables her to deal massive damage. To summarize her gameplay loop, she prioritizes filling up this star/mark on enemies, and for every line or breakpoint on this star, she can then use her non-energy costing special attack to then activate a dash, which deals a new type of damage known as Aftershock. With her kit and design, Aftershock damage is massively buffed when Anby uses it, so performing her dashes and taking advantage of its Aftershock damage is how she'll deal the highest DPS. This means getting as many dashes as possible will be important, if not directly responsible for how much damage she can actually deal. Moving back to her marks, however, even though she can dash and activate her marks every tick, she gains the most value from dashing at max, where she can then use 3 dashes in a row, activating Thunder Smite. This Smite attack is activated after additional damage from White Thunder triggers 3 times on the same enemy. So in short, fill the star mark, press special attack 3 times once it's filled, then profit. In my last team's video, I didn't emphasize an important disclaimer well enough, so let me include this now. The following section is an explanation and summary of Anby's mechanics, but the actual full breakdown will come in the later guide released at the start of her banner, so stay tuned for that. With this out of the way, let's now break down what her kit is all about. Anby's core passive grants her increased damage against enemies marked with Silver Star by 25%. Additionally, the crit damage of Aftershock attacks is further increased by 30% of Soldier-0 Anby's crit damage, so this is something that you'll want to consider when you're building her. Her additional ability is activated when she's paired with either a stun or support character, making team pairings with her very easy. But in terms of what she gains, Anby's crit rate is increased by 10%, and in addition to this, whenever she's the active character on field, all members' Aftershock damage to enemies that are marked increases by 25%. Now that her passives and free stats are addressed, let's talk about her actual abilities. Her basic attacks are flashy, and you can also repeatedly press or hold a basic input after the 4th part of this move to pass through enemies up to 5 times. These attacks deal okay damage, but their real purpose is to generate stacks for her mark system. On the topic of her mark system, it's time we now talk about her special attacks. As mentioned previously, when hitting roughly a third of the star, or whenever you reach one of the ticks on this mark, Anby is given the ability to dash through an enemy via her special attack. This move specifically is known as Azure Flash. When Anby has a third of the mark filled, the enemy receives 1 stack of White Thunder, and once the enemy has 3 stacks of White Thunder, Anby can perform Azure Flash through the target 3 times in a row for damage and to activate her second special attack ability, Thunder Smite. This Smite attack, as we've already mentioned previously, is also an Aftershock damage based move, so making sure to meet its condition so that you can activate it is very important. Regarding her energy costing special attack, this is when Anby throws her swords forward and deals a decent amount of damage. When she performs this attack, however, she also fully charges her star mark, which would then result in 3 additional dashes for your using. Anby's dodge counter is worth mentioning since it fills Anby's star mark quickly, but otherwise her dodge related abilities are pretty standard. The final move I wanted to address is her ultimate, which deals significant damage. To add to this though, this ability will also fully charge her mark just like it did with her EX special attack. Now on a final note, because of her passives, free stats, and the way that she scales, building as much crit damage as possible is important. However, it is equally as important to know that she will still need a decent amount of crit rate. Therefore, because of this, and as we mentioned with the crit damage earlier, using a 4th slot crit rate disk drive will be very helpful if you can find the stats and a good disk drive with this specifically. Before we get into the teams, I would first like to explain the structure of my tests. First and foremost, the teams listed and described in this next section will always include a stunner or support, since Anby's additional ability provides so much value. That said, I did do testing on other characters like Yanagi, Bernice, and other agents too for the purposes of this video. What I discovered in these scenarios was that Bernice, Miyabi, and Yanagi are still pretty OP regardless of who you use them with. Despite this though, these teams have restrictions, limitations, or other concerns that make them less realistic or recommended than others, so do with that what you will. Another important point in terms of my testing was concerning standards and setup for all my tests. The following team results assumed M6 on A ranks, M0 on S ranks, and the signature W engines / reasonable alternatives of every character. This means a character like Ching-Yi would have her signature, and someone like Lucy would have kaboomed the cannon. However, additional tests or adjustment to these builds were sometimes conducted if a signature performed too poorly. I'm looking at you, Anby. Additionally, these findings will need context, as things like the boss target, the boss's health, buffs, and other factors can affect the results of the teams. Understandably, there is a world where every character could receive their perfect scenario, but that would take me a year to calculate, make fair, and then test. With that though, here is what I found when testing 100 different Anby teams. The first style of team that I tested the most was Soldier-0 Anby paired with a stunner and a support. From my findings, this definitely made Anby safer and more straightforward to play, but as we'll see in a moment, the stunners weren't always the best partners for Anby. Among them, however, there was a clear trend of Pulchra and Qingyi being much better than the others. These two characters definitely felt best because of the impact of the different buffs that each stunner provided to her. Between the two though, it should be known that Qingyi's average clear speed across different teams was higher than Pulchra's. But in certain lineups, when paired with someone like Astra, Pulchra's results were actually faster by a decent amount. Something also worth mentioning here though is that Qingyi did have to get optimized in some of these runs, as Anby appreciated being on field much more than the other attack agents. Simply staying on field with Qingyi and spamming her basics or EX special until the enemy was stunned yielded much worse results than the optimizations that I had to perform. Because of this, you could argue that Pulchra's simple gameplay of applying stuns off field therefore could give her the edge, especially if you consider that she didn't have to make these optimizations. But regardless of all this, the performance of Qingyi and Pulchra were anywhere between 15 to 20% faster than their competitors. Of course, certain compositions involving characters like Astra did close the gap between teams significantly, but overall this was bad news for any of you guys that wanted to play double Anby together. Don't let this or me stop you from trying that team though, it's actually pretty funny. Now let's talk about the non-Qingyi or Pulchra teams. Although those two stunners felt best when paired with Anby, there were still moments when other characters felt strong with her too. Astra-based teams, of course, were all decent options when pairing Anby with the support, and in most cases this was enough to elevate any stunner's performance by a decent amount. Lighter specifically had excellent showings in the Anby Lighter Astra team comp, leaving a close performance actually to Qingyi or Pulchra in terms of their peaks. This was because of his direct synergy to swaps and assists in general, but it also helped that his stun duration increase allowed more attacks from Anby. Aside from this though, Kaleda and the stunner version of Anby performed poorly if not paired with Astra or Caesar. However, interestingly, Rina and Sokaku ended up performing much worse than I thought when paired with any of these stunners, despite the shock synergy or the fact that the enemy had ice weakness on them. After all this testing, however, I did have recommendations to provide, assuming you have these agents or want to pull for Anby. First, if you were going to use a stunner and support with Soldier-0 Anby, using Caesar or Astra as your support will be ideal. That's pretty obvious though, since these two characters are typically the highest performers across any team. This is also the case with their best stun partners, where Qingyi and Pulchra outperformed the rest. Despite these results, however, I would still recommend using someone like Lucy if Astra or Caesar aren't available, as the synergy between most stunners, Anby, and Lucy's M6 is extremely strong. From the stunning end, if Pulchra Qingyi or some variation of this is impossible, replacing the stun slot with Lighter / Kaleda, or waiting until we get our free Pulchra from 1.6's events is also a decent option too. Next, we have the double support section. To nobody's surprise, this had the fastest clear times of all tested options, but as always, these results were slightly skewed because of the boss's health. Although these support teams could in theory still perform decently even against tankier enemies, the squishiness of said targets definitely aided in faster times and in the better performance that you're seeing right now. Moving on from this though, it's now time we talk about the results of the double supports. Astra and Caesar among the utility / support characters had the best performances as you'd expect. In terms of results, they ended up roughly 20 to 30% faster on average, and this definitely makes sense as Anby certainly felt worse to play with if you included her with characters like Ben and Sokaku, but nonetheless this was worth investigating and testing. Astra and Caesar based Anby teams on the other hand were extremely simple to play and felt satisfying too. Swapping between allies with Astra while being buffed or face tanking every single enemy with Caesar's barrier while still having an attack increase felt amazing. Anby herself definitely prefers having buffs and ways to prevent yourself from being interrupted while swinging, so both agent pairings were ideal for her. But as always, comparing the two together, Caesar's offensive buffs were not nearly as competitive as someone like Astra's. Beyond these two supports, I did test other double support compositions, but admittedly once again, this concept really only worked for a few cases. Even against an enemy who had less health than deadly assault bosses, pairings like Ben, Seth, or even Sokaku just didn't feel worthwhile. These teams were uncomfortable at best and outright disastrous at worst, especially if they didn't have Astra or Caesar as potential partners. Now, of course, this didn't mean that every team was unusable, but it certainly meant that most of these teams were heavily aided by other characters to succeed. Moving away from these agents, Lucy specifically also had good showings across all tests, regardless if it was double support or stunner support. This was likely due to her 6 Mindscape giving additional value when using EX special attacks, but overall, this translated to much faster results compared to her peers, so she was definitely an option I kept an eye on. Rina, on the other hand, had some of the most diverse showings across teams, with quick and honestly impressive clear times, followed by some of the shockingly slowest ones soon after. Recommendations wise, I would definitely stick to character pairings like Caesar Astra plus another support, but overall there were still decent performances from agents like Lucy and Nicole, or even Rina on occasion. Despite all this, I would still only recommend using double support teams if you have the premium options within this category, as without it, the teams definitely feel lackluster otherwise. Now it's time we talk about the fastest and most consistent team that I found across all tests. If you paid attention to the varying screenshots of clear times when I talked about certain teams, you might have noticed that the fastest recorded clear that I had was with Anby, Caesar, and Astra. However, what you didn't see was me running every other team 5 to 6 times to get anything even remotely close to this result. Teams like Nicole Astra or even Pulchra Astra definitely have their strengths, and I also acknowledge that these test results are likely a result of skill issue on my behalf. Put plainly, Anby, Caesar, Astra was the most consistent performer for me regardless of what happened. Between having the freedom to swing as many times as I'd like and also being able to easily apply all buffs and debuffs simultaneously, this team cleared the fastest and most consistently by far. Now, despite this, you could definitely argue that a team involving someone like Pulchra/Chingyi for tankier enemies or using Nicole Astra for the super optimizers could definitely yield different results and therefore an alternative best team, but this was simply what I found from my testing. Now that the teams and kits have been explained, let's talk about Soldier-0 Anby's pre-farm materials. In order to upgrade her to max, you'll need the following: 3,705,000 Dennies for the purpose of upgrading your agent's skills and ascensions, 30 Pioneer Seals, 32 Advanced Attack Seals, and 4 Basic Attack Seals to ascend Anby to level 60. You'll also need 300 Senior Investigator logs as always to level her to 60. In terms of her skills, you'll need 250 Specialized, 75 Advanced, and 25 Basic Electric Chips. And if you're looking to get to level 12, you'll also need 5 Hamster Cage passes too. To completely upgrade her core passive, you'll also need 9 Notorious Hunt materials from the Unknown Corruption Complex boss, and their materials are known as Living Drives. Finally, you'll need 60 higher dimension data drops from a new boss known as Lumberjack and Expert Challenge, but sorry to say for you early pre-farmers though, this Expert Challenge unfortunately isn't available yet. If you're looking to pull and upgrade her signature W engine, you'll need the following: 400,000 Dennies, 30 Specialized, 32 Reinforced, and 4 attack components, and to level said W engine to max, you'll also need 200 W engine energy modules too. On the topic of her disk drive set, it should be no surprise that the new set released with 1.6 will also be her best option. This set was obviously designed specifically with Anby in mind, as the condition to activate its 4-piece effect is almost effortless from Anby's part. Now, in addition to this, the 2-piece effect that Anby gains by equipping the set is also helpful given how well she can utilize the aftershock damage, but in terms of other options, using Woodpecker as your alternative 4-piece and then using any stat providing set for her 2-piece effect like Hormone Punk, Puffer Electro, Woodpecker, or even Thundering Metal is fine too. As always though, remember that having more substat rules is usually the best play. For W engine choice, Anby is another character whose signature is the best for her by about 20 to 25% compared to free-to-play W engines. However, this time around, if you already have Haramasa or Evelyn signatures, the gap between performance drops to roughly 15% instead. This is mostly because both W engines have decent stats attached to them, but otherwise Marcato and Starlight Engine are your go-to for Anby. Finally, I now have here the pros and cons for Anby after testing her a lot, so now here's what you should think about before playing her. Her damage is by far the best of the electric attack agents currently available, outperforming Haramasa and Anton. Anby also spends a lot of time on field, so if you're someone who wants to just see Anby 24/7, well, your prayers have been answered. Next, one of Anby's best partners is Pulchra, and she'll be given for free during one of 1.6's events. Moving along, ZenlessZoneZero has also released a dedicated set to Anby specifically that perfectly synergizes with the way that she wants to play, so that's a major plus. And finally, the last pro that I have is that Anby's attacks and animations honestly look really flashy and cool. Now, regarding her cons, her signature W engine is much better than non-limited alternatives, with its performance being at least 20% better in most cases, and as a result, if you don't have her signature, she can definitely feel a bit weaker to play. In addition to this, Anby's mark can sometimes be difficult to see at times, as moving enemies and skill effects can clutter up the screen. And finally, Anby is not going to be Miyabi levels of damage if that's what you're expecting, or if this was a question that you had. So keep this in mind if you're considering pulling for Anby. That's going to be it for today's video though, guys. Thank you again for watching. Hope you guys learned something. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you check out the rest of my socials, leave a comment, turn on the notification bell, subscribe, like the video if you want to see more content like this. And as always, guys, thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.